Good morning. I'm Brian Prescott, the president of NCHEMS. I've got several colleagues here who will lead this webinar, but I'm excited to welcome you to this discussion on how state post-secondary funding policies address the particular needs of students and institutions located in rural communities. In our work at NCHEMS over the past several years, we have increasingly encountered the challenges that rural communities face in accessing post-secondary education programs that boost opportunities for their residents. And as we enter a period of demographic decline, at least among young people, those challenges are going to become more acute. States have an obligation to ensure that all their residents, no matter where they live, are able to benefit from higher education. Yet good information about the ways states can strengthen connections between their policies, and especially funding policies, and rural needs has been sparse. So with some foundational information about how state funding strategies can help address sustainability for rural colleges and universities, we hope this webinar will help fill some of that gap, as well as to elevate the need for attention to rural populations' access to relevant post-secondary education. And with that welcome out of the way, I'll turn the rest of the webinar over to my fellow NCHEMS staff and our partners. Thanks for being here.
Great, thanks, Brian, and hello, everyone. Let me add my thanks to each of you for joining us today for this important conversation. My name is Brian Sponsor. I'm the managing partner at SOVA and a consultant on this project with my NCHEMS colleagues. I'm pleased to serve as a facilitator for today's conversation and to welcome you officially to this session on designing state funding models that sustain rural colleges and universities. This is a topic that cuts across policy, equity, and economic development, and it's one that we think deserves far greater attention than it's getting. For many rural institutions, the way a state structures its funding formula can make the difference between sustainability and struggle. Our goals for today are pretty straightforward. First, to explore how rurality is defined and why that definition matters in shaping state-level funding decisions. Second, to examine the funding disparities that rural institutions are currently facing. And third, to offer strategies that state and system leaders can use to better align their state funding formulas with the realities of our rural communities and individuals seeking further post-secondary education. This session is anchored in a policy brief that NCHEMS released today, the result of several months of research and analysis by a team with deep expertise in state finance, state budgets, and rural higher education systems. You'll hear from members of that team over the course of the next hour. All of them remain eager to engage beyond just today's session to support a more impactful development of practices and effective policies that can support the communities we're speaking about. So please think of today as the beginning of a conversation rather than the end, and that this is a collective dialogue we hope to continue as we move forward. A couple of housekeeping items before we dive in. After we talk through the report's key findings, we will have some time reserved for discussion. So please make note of any questions that you have as we move through today's presentation. The Q&A feature that Zoom has is open now for all of our participants, and you can find the Q&A button at the bottom bar on your screen. I'll be monitoring these questions as they come in, and we'll elevate some key questions or thematic areas to begin our discussion at the end of our formal presentation, and you'll have a continued opportunity to ask follow-up questions using that feature. Also, there is a lot of thought-provoking and critical information that's going to be shared with you over the next 45 minutes or so. Please don't worry about trying to catch it all in one setting. We will be sending out the slides, a recording of today's webinar, and the full report to all of you by the end of the week. And finally, if you do encounter any technical difficulties, please feel free to let us know in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to support you on the back end. Finally, it's worth noting that the work you're about to hear about has done a real service, I think, to how we think and talk about post-secondary education in rural communities. We hope that today's sessions will challenge and push your thinking of what educational opportunity means as something beyond just access, though that's clearly essential. In the rural context, this is also about whether students can persist, whether the institutions that they're able to attend can offer a full range of programs, and whether the communities that these institutions and individuals reside in can count on higher education as part of the economic anchor and talent pipeline for these spaces. That's the broader landscape we're working in, and your interest in these topics is really critically important. So thank you again for joining us today. With that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Artemio, a research associate and one of the lead authors of the report at NCHEMS, to dive into the material. Artemio, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Brian. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to talk with you. I think that you may, attending today's session, may be familiar with NCHEMS, but I think a good place to start is with an introduction of NCHEMS. NCHEMS stands for the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems. We're a nonprofit organization that envisions a future in which post-secondary education expands opportunities and strengthens communities. We do this by working with institutions, systems, states, governments, and community leaders to bring data, evidence together to improve strategic decision-making in post-secondary education. And one of my favorite parts of NCHEMS is the long history that we have, starting in the 60s and 70s up until today, being involved in higher education policy. We have a great team that we've assembled of internal and external partners that have worked on this project. All members have contributed greatly to this project, and this work would not be possible without their hard work and insight in both developing the rural policy brief, as well as this webinar, and then work on this broader project. We've gone over some of the initial points, but today I'm going to start with going over an overview of the rural funding project to give an understanding of the broader project we're working on. Then we're going to take a deeper dive into many of the components of this, our policy brief in this webinar. First, by framing the opportunities that are available within rural communities. We're going to talk about some of the labor market and educational assets and needs in rural spaces. Then we're going to talk about perhaps the hot topic, which is what is rural? How do we define rurality? There's many different definitions out there. It's always a great debate and a good conversation to have. We'll talk about experiences and do a comparative analysis of some of these definitions. We'll talk about higher education assets in rural communities, and we're actually going to look at some really fun and interesting research that has been done in this area, and talking about institutions within rural spaces and state funding for these institutions. And I think this is an exciting portion of the presentation. Then we'll wrap things up by talking about some potential policy solutions and options that state policymakers can consider by couching it within the different state funding models that are out there. And we'll also discuss states that are working in this area as well. Now we'll wrap the presentation today with a Q&A session for you to participate and ask some good questions. So I'm first starting the project overview. NCHEMS is working on a grant-funded project, and what started this project was some of the NCHEMS prior work. NCHEMS has worked with states, is currently working with states, and has previously worked with states on reviewing state funding models. And we've come to understand that many of the state funding models actually prove to show that some models could harm or disadvantage students from rural communities. And when taking a deeper dive into this topic, we realized that there's a gap in research on this particular topic, both academic research as well as policy research. And then there was also a lack of policy guidance available to states hoping to strengthen these connections between state funding models and rural students and institutions. And then also there was a lack of information about the unique needs of rural institutions and rural students. So while there is content out there, we felt that could be supplemented. And so those are particularly the three areas of focus of our project. It's looking at producing research on this topic and producing additional policy guidance, and then highlighting the distinct challenges and needs in rural communities. And this work is important to NCHEMS because, again, going back to our vision, NCHEMS is focused on strengthening communities for all in all different parts of the country. And this was a unique opportunity for that, especially given NCHEMS work with state funding models, and then also NCHEMS connection with state policymakers and continuing work with them. NCHEMS is also working on some other rural projects, for example, with rural extension, associated with land grants. So we're able to create some synergy in some of the work that we're doing. And all these came together in identifying the need, supporting rural communities in many different ways. And this project aligns with that as well. So first, I want to get started with understanding the educational opportunities in rural communities to provide some context to our conversation. This is one of my favorite graphs out there, produced by Corey, the Center on Rural Innovation. There's three main takeaways that I would have from this graph. I'll first introduce it. On the x-axis, we see years going from 1969 to 2021. On the y-axis, we'll see a percentage representing employment relative to 1969 levels, with 100% being 1969. The three main takeaways of this graph are that, one, there's a gap between non-rural and rural communities in terms of employment and employment opportunities. And this gap has been growing over time. Number two, one of the things here we see, if we look at after the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, rural communities have not been able to particularly recover from the Great Recession. Only recently have rural communities in terms of employment recovered, whereas non-rural communities after the Great Recession recovered fairly quickly in comparison. And three, which is the point of that Corey is showing here, is that this is all associated with the knowledge economy. Especially they've identified 1980 as the start of the knowledge economy. And post-secondary credentials and education are associated with allowing individuals to be successful in a knowledge economy. And if there's less educational opportunities, it's harder for individuals in rural communities to be able to participate within this knowledge economy. And the consequences of this are an increasing gap in employment opportunities and just general opportunities in rural communities. So there's an opportunity here for state policymakers to make a difference in helping to close this gap. When we look at educational attainment within rural and urban areas, there's this graph here from the USDA. On the left side, you see rural educational attainment, and on the right side, urban educational attainment. It's broken out by two separate years, the year 2000 and the year 2019. When comparing the two groups, we see that there is a gap in educational attainment, with individuals in urban areas having more, especially post-secondary education rates compared to rural communities. However, when we look at within groups of the two different years, we see that differences have been made, especially in terms of post-secondary education, in that rural communities were able to expand and increase their percentages of post-secondary education attainment. So again, this is an opportunity. While a gap does exist, strides have been made in closing this gap. It's also important to consider that individuals graduating from rural high schools graduate at the same rates as individuals graduating from urban high schools. So really, students are starting off at a similar plane, but due to access, due to cost, there's some challenges that rural students face. So there's, again, opportunities here to help close this gap. Another interesting trend within rural communities is over the past several decades, there's been a decline in population in many of our rural spaces. And while this has been a challenge for rural communities, there's actually been some glimmers of hope in regards to migration. So since the pandemic, there was actually increases in migration to rural communities. And this, again, provides another opportunity or shows that there's another opportunity as individuals move to rural spaces. It can bring additional resources, jobs, employment, and more opportunity to rural spaces. So strides have been made, and there's potentially new opportunities going forward into the future. Finally, I want to wrap up with the type of institutions that are involved in rural spaces. First, the research shows that most students who graduate from rural high schools tend to they attend all different types of higher education institutions, but they tend to attend or enroll in public institutions. And particularly, recent research shows that the location of those institutions may matter. So this study this recent study looked at public four-year institutions in a state, and they found that there was statistically significant retention and attainment for rural students who attended a rural public institution. So location matters. The institutions that are well positioned to serve rural students tend to be or could be public institutions located in rural areas. And with that, I want to hand it over to Jasmine Collins, one of our partners from the University of Illinois, to talk about rural definitions.
Okay, thank you so much, Artemio. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so as we're thinking about the need to center rural learners and communities within higher education funding policy, it's important for us to do some level setting around what is meant rural. And in the most basic sense, the concept of rurality really is rooted in land and how the land is used. So land mass wise, the United States is the third largest country in the world, and rural land accounts for 97% of our country's geography. And roughly 1/5 of our population lives in rural locales. But rurality, of course, is far from monolithic, and rural communities can be comprised of mountains, forests, farms, beaches, deserts, farms, small towns from coast to coast. And so trying to come up with a singular definition of rurality is, maybe not the most useful, and also it's kind of impossible to do. But we did take an opportunity to look at the federal level and to think about how the federal government classifies rurality. And at the federal level alone, there are more than 20 categorizations. Artemio, you can go to the next slide. There are more than 20 categorizations of rurality, which include considerations of population, economics, educational attainment, population loss, and other social, regional, and cultural factors. And so in our analysis, we did focus primarily on the swath of federal definitions, as these often serve as the basis for federal funding eligibility and institutional classifications that are useful in research. And state policies might also be closely linked to these federal guidelines. But there are likely many more ways of thinking about rurality at state, institution, and local levels. And so we do want to recognize that our work here is in no way comprehensive in that sense. You can go to the next slide, Artemio. So we will make available the definitions guide that we put together in preparation for our policy brief and this webinar today. And within that document, you will see that we have categorized the federal definitions around sort of 4 broad categorization or classification schemes, even though there is quite a bit of overlap between the definitions. But we thought it was helpful to sort of think about these definitions thematically, and those categories that we came up with were population-based classifications, socioeconomic-based classifications, regional classifications, and rural education classifications. So I will give a brief example of each of these. And again, as Brian mentioned at the top of the webinar, no need to try to furiously take notes. We will make the full guide available to you all in the coming weeks. Next slide, Artemio. So the first classification is population-based, and this has to do with how densely settled an area is. Rurality in the United States is typically defined by the census by first identifying what is an urban area and then classifying everything that's not urban as rural. And so from this standpoint, urbanized areas contain more than 50,000 people, while an urban cluster or an urban territory may contain at least 2,500 people, but fewer than 50,000 people. And this is at the census tract level. So the USDA Economic Research Service, you can stay on this slide for another minute, Artemio. So the USDA Economic Research Service has a similar dichotomous like rural-urban classification scheme that they use, and this is analyzed at the county level, but they call this metro and non-metro. So you might sometimes in research see non-metro used synonymously with rural, but they are using slightly different ways that they're measuring populations within these classifications. But within the metro, non-metro classification, non-metro counties include some combination of open countryside, rural towns of fewer than 5,000 residents and 2,000 housing units, and urban areas with up to 50,000 residents that are not part of a larger labor market or metropolitan area. So this, as you see on your slide here, metro, non-metro is one example of population-based rurality definition at the county level. You can go next slide, Artemio. Rural-urban continuum codes are another example of a population-based classification system by the USDA, but they further break down that metro, non-metro dichotomous categorization into 9 different sub-categorizations with 3 metro and 6 non-metro. And each county and census designated county equivalent in the United States is assigned to one of these 9 codes within this classification scheme, which allows researchers and policymakers and others to sort of view county level characteristics in finer detail. And so this map here shows rural-urban continuum codes. A related classification scheme that we don't have an actual map for, but that sounds a lot like the rural-urban continuum codes is the rural-urban commuting codes, which are RUCA codes. And these are actually based on the Office of Management and Budget's Metropolitan Statistical Area or MSA codes, which are metropolitan, micropolitan, or 9 non-core counties, which are then further divided into 6 subcategories. And these definitions consider labor force ties such as residential commuting patterns and economic integration within adjacent counties. So RUCA codes measure population density, degree of urbanization, and daily commuting patterns to indicate how economically integrated adjacent territories are with one another. And RUCA codes, unlike rural-urban continuum codes, use census tract data instead of county level data to give you an even more refined unit of analysis and a more detailed picture. This is a lot of detailed information, but this is, how you might consider what kind of definitional classification you want to use when thinking about defining rurality within your particular region, state, or institution, right? So if you go to the next slide, Artemio. So another way to sort of think about defining rurality in addition to population or socioeconomic classifications might be from a regional perspective. So if census tracts are the smallest geographic unit that we have to be able to analyze conditions in a region or in a small area, then regional classifications kind of give us a broader take and allow us to think about common experiences across a region that might share a similar geography or culture or history or socioeconomic condition. So the Appalachian region, for example, is made up of 423 counties across 13 states and over 24 million residents, and is also comprised of 3 federally recognized and 5 state recognized Native American tribal communities. So sometimes it makes sense to think about funding policy beyond just your sort of state or locale, but in terms of the entire, especially if they're closely tied economically. Next slide, Artemio. And lastly, our definitions guide includes definitions for thinking about rural serving institutions and rural students. And so one of the, most of the definitions that you will see sort of being a rural serving institution is from NCES's classification scheme, but ARC's definition, which you all may be familiar with, the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges, takes only not only the institutions geographic location into account, but other factors such as the home county's adjacency to a metro area and percent of an institution's total awards conferred in agriculture, natural resources, and parks and recreation, with the idea being that an institution can serve as sort of a workforce development hub for a region, for a rural area, even if the institution is not necessarily located in a rural county itself. So for more work on, or for more information about how NCHEMS is thinking about rural students and rural serving institutions, I will now turn it over to Louisa.
Thanks, Jasmine. I'm Louisa Hunkerstorm, a senior associate at NCHEMS. So yeah, the next step after we compiled all these definitions was to apply them to the locations of public colleges and universities across the country. And what we found overall, I'm not quite there yet, Artemio, sorry, is that an institution determined to be rural under one definition was very likely to be considered rural according to other definitions. We started by mapping 4 different definitions that we expected to be pretty different based on how they were defined, and found that they consistently categorized over 90% of the public Title IV eligible institutions in this country. So what that means for us is that the definition that you use does matter, but it doesn't matter maybe quite as much as I expected when I started out, especially not for a nationwide analysis. The definition can matter a lot at the local level, which you will see when I show you the interactive map we created to demonstrate this in a few minutes. So I'm ready for the next slide. But first, let's talk about the big picture and which types of institutions are rural. So this graph uses the metro, non-metro definition that Jasmine showed, which is sort of the baseline, most common definition. When we think of rural institutions, we should be thinking about community colleges and regional comprehensive universities, which in this graph are called public, master's, bachelor's, and other 4-year. Those 2 sectors account for 85% of the public institutions in rural places. So they're the ones that we have really focused on in our brief that accompanies this webinar. I'll also note that, you know, the minority of the population is rural. The minority of institutions are also rural. There are fewer than half as many rural institutions as urban ones. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide. So with that background, we looked at public funding differences between rural and urban institutions by sector. And when we say funding for these purposes, we're talking about state and local appropriations, which we got from IPEDS, divided that by the student FTE, and then calculated the medians for each sector using several different definitions. What we found is that urban 4-year institutions are more highly funded than rural 4-year institutions under all 3 of these definitions that we did this deep analysis on. And that applies to both public research universities, although there's very few rural public research universities, and regional comprehensive 4-year institutions. And like I said, it's true across these 3 definitions of rurality, both metro, non-metro, the NCES locales definition, which is created by the US Department of Education, and the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges rural serving definition. At the level of community colleges and less than 2-year institutions, it was a little bit of a different story. We found that rural institutions are actually more highly funded, again, just talking about state and local appropriations, than urban ones, according to 2 of these definitions, but not according to the 3rd one. And some of those higher funding levels might be related to institution size. A lot of rural community colleges are very small, and for that reason, they can struggle to achieve some of the economies of scale that larger institutions are able to take advantage of. So they have some of the same fixed costs like facilities, administration, technology, but they're spread across fewer students. And what that translates into is a need for higher levels of public support. And that's especially true as these institutions are often real anchors and cornerstones in their communities. And so we're seeing evidence of that public support in some of these numbers. So these are national trends. The picture actually looks quite different when we drill down to the state level, which is the next slide. Okay, so these maps show rural funding at these institutions, again, state and local appropriations, as a percentage of urban funding by state for each of these 4 institutional sectors. The states that are more orange or brown are the ones where rural institutions are more highly funded than urban institutions for that sector. And the states that are blue have higher funding at their urban institutions in that sector. A lot of the states are white. Those are ones that don't have both a rural and an urban institution in that sector. And what you'll see is there's a really wide range of colors, and each map for each sector looks different. And what that tells us is that dynamics really do vary a lot depending on where you go and exactly which institutions you're talking about. And then we could make it even more complex by, again, acknowledging this is just one definition of rurality. This is the metro, non-metro definition. And although, as I said before, there is a lot of overlap between definitions, these colors would probably look somewhat different if we picked a different definition. So with all of that in mind, we created an interactive map for all of you and anyone else in the public to use to explore all the details. The URL will be in the slide deck we send out after this presentation. But for now, I just want to show it to you, show you what it looks like and what kinds of types of things you can explore with it. So let me share. Gotta hit the share button. Okay, so here is the map. And it shows all of the public Title IV eligible institutions in the country overlaid on 3 different rural definitions. And you can filter to look at different definitions and different institutions. We have 3 different definitions. You can filter by state. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we're going to look for the purposes of this demonstration at Illinois. So now what we're seeing is all of the public institutions in Illinois overlaid on top of the metro, non-metro definition of rurality. And if we want, we can filter that further to say, actually, let's only look at community colleges and just see how those stack up. And what you can see is down here, we show rural versus urban institutions. It will tell you for all the filters that you've selected, how many institutions there are, the median annual student FTE, and the median state and local appropriations per FTE. And we can then change the definition that we're looking at and see how that changes and see which definitions are now urban and rural. If we want to look at just rural, we could go ahead and filter those out. And if you want to see more detail, you can zoom in and you can click on a specific institution and see its sector, how it is categorized according to these 3 different definitions of rurality, which we selected because they're quite different from each other, even though they pretty consistently categorize most institutions. They look quite different on the map. And then it tells you each institution's FTE and state and local appropriations. So the intention here, oh, I forgot one more thing, sorry. I also wanted to show you that it's possible to filter by institution size, because as I pointed out, the size of the institution can affect its state and local appropriations per FTE because of the economies of scale question. And so if you wanted to compare just small institutions to other small institutions, it is possible to do that and then see how the comparisons change. All right, that's the end of that demonstration. So the intention here is so that people like you in this audience who are working at the state system or institutional level can explore your specific local dynamics, see how the funding differences are playing out in your context, and see how different definitions of rurality apply to you. So with that, I will hand things back over to Artemio to talk about state funding models.
Thanks, Louisa. All right. So now we'll talk about some policy options and how states can build a rural focus within their funding approaches. A great way to start with this is about the different types of funding models that states use. And these are 4 categories that were developed by the State Higher Education Executive Office, otherwise known as SHEO, and with partners to categorize some of the state funding models that exist out there. These main components are base plus and institutional requests. These 2 types of funding models typically involve a system or coordinating board putting forward a proposal to the state for a percentage increase to their budget based on the prior year. And the percentage allocated by the state legislature to the institutions can depend on economic conditions. And thinking about the rural institutions and rural students, if rural institutions have not been historically funded adequately, a base plus and institutional requests can often exacerbate these inequities going forward, since the focus is on sometimes just percentages based on what the resources available to the state. Institutional request systems can allow rural institutions to receive funding, but often this may just be one-time funding and may not be consistent over many years to help address differences in funding levels. Some states have an input-driven system. This would help for the states that have this type of funding model. They can account for rural institutions in thinking about facilities costs or costs that are associated with institutions in rural areas. And of course, the increasingly popular performance and outcomes-based components to funding models can include preference for completions for students coming from rural high schools, or any various definitions or subpopulations that states want to focus on. States don't always just use one of these models, they interact with each other. So there's opportunities for states to focus on institutions and students, or just institutions or just students, depending on how their model is structured. And thinking about states that do use some type of rural definition and focus on rural students, there's actually just one example nationwide, which is the state of Oregon. They're an interesting case. They focus on specifically first full-time students. They use the location of the high school for which the student graduated, and they focus on completions of those students coming from the rural high schools. They have a performance outcomes-based component to their state funding model, and for the institutions that enroll the rural students, they receive an increase in state appropriations if the student completes. Of course, there's limitations to this case. When you focus specifically on students on the location of the high school, you lose out on supporting students that are rural transfers, adult students, homeschool students, and students associated with GED programs. Furthermore, also the definition matters. And in the case of Oregon, they use the NCES locale codes. For policy actions, states can consider selecting a definition and thinking about which definition to select. It often depends on the strategic priorities of the state, and analyzing which definitions help to meet the goals of what the state legislature or the communities, the needs of rural communities. One important part of this process is data collection. Institutions can collect really good data on where students are coming from or their rural student experiences that can help inform policy. There's 2 different types of ways to support students and institutions in rural communities. That's to take a student-focused perspective or an institution-focused perspective. For student-focused, this can be enrollment based or state financial aid policy based. There could be special grants that are awarded to rural students coming from rural communities. And as state outcomes and performance-based models can include the enrollment and completion of students coming from rural areas. For institution policies, it's acknowledging differentiation of costs that rural institutions may face. There's for the states that include credit hour weights, there could be considerations of how credit hours are associated with rural students. And then, of course, one-time or ongoing adjustments can help make a difference for rural institutions. With that, we can move to the Q&A session.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate the presentation and conversation. A lot of good information. We've had a couple of questions that were submitted previously from individuals who had an access to see that version of the report, and so I wanted to get an opportunity to share those with you. And one specifically was around if states want to include a rural indicator in funding models, and I'll let the three of you sort of determine in real time who wants to take this, or multiple answers are fine. You know, how should they think about balancing accuracy versus simplicity in choosing that definition? So especially when we think about the broader number of maybe lower information, but sort of high authority individuals that are involved in policy decisions, legislatures, the broader public. There's very specific grain sizes we can get to that may have some advantages in research studies, but in terms of designing policy and thinking about the trade-offs between simplicity and accuracy or specificity, do you have any thoughts or guidance about that as policymakers are considering those decisions?
I can start off with that question. I think communication is key, especially in talking about rurality. What is rural can mean very different things to different people. And I would first start with the objectives of the state, objectives of what the state's trying to accomplish before actually getting into the details about which rural definition is selected. And then trying to choose a definition that is either used within the state and aligns with other programs or policies, so that it's easier. There's already content out there. There's a shared understanding of what that means. So again, it's about communication, strategic priority goals, and then again, which you said, simplicity.
Yeah, and I can address that a bit too, Brian. One of the things that we were thinking about is these, as Artemio described them, sort of student-focused definitions versus institution-focused definitions. So is the institution located in a rural area is for sure the simpler way to go. And you can pick a variety of definitions, but it just has to do with where is the main campus. And so that is easy to understand, and it doesn't change over time. I suppose a community can go from rural to non-rural, but it's less flexible than just a more complicated question would be, does this institution serve rural students? Which could change from year to year depending on where the students are coming from. And it takes a lot more data to figure that out. And it's probably a little more opaque to figure that out. And I would echo what Artemio said about it really depends why you're doing this, right? If you're thinking, oh, we need to recognize rurality in the funding model because our rural institutions have these big transportation costs and it's more expensive to get things there. That has to do with the location of the institution. If you're thinking they serve a lot of students who come from these locations where they need more student support, they don't have, their communities don't have big histories of a lot of people who are college graduates, then it might make sense to choose a more student-focused definition.
Great, thank you. And I have one other question that's come in. So make a compelling case that rural serving institutions often receive less funding per student than their urban peers, and that the cost structures for them may actually be higher for some of those institutions. So this is a question about making this a priority. So just from your work here and other work that you mentioned NCHEMS is doing in this space, what do you think are some of the biggest barriers that are keeping state policymakers from addressing or thinking about these funding gaps? Are they aware of them and aren't sure what to do, which is sort of different than there's a lack of sort of broad awareness? Just as we think about maintaining some forward momentum in this kind of work and addressing the issues that you've pointed out, what are some of the priors we have about why we think this is a challenge that we're still trying to get folks to address?
Personally, I think it's just limitations and resources available to states and a lack of understanding about the topic. I think institutions have been vocal about the increased costs, especially institutions within rural spaces. I'm fairly sure that in each state, the president of each of these institutions, 2- and 4-year institutions that are in rural areas, understand the differing costs, both in building maintenance or building construction, and the challenges that the students have in rural spaces about accessing the institution, community differences, and they're very vocal to their state legislatures about these issues. But it's just about having some actual policy guidance that I think available to state policymakers on what differences they can make, both in just additional funding and resources, as well as other things that are not cost related that states can do.
Yeah, and if I can also address that, I think changing funding models is always hard because unless you're in an environment of financial plenty, which most places are not, it feels like there's winners and losers. And that's always hard. And the institutions that think they're being disadvantaged by the change will disagree with it. And so I think that's a big barrier. And it just takes a lot of work to articulate the reasons for it and get all the right people on board.
I also want to add that states are interested in subgroup populations and supporting them, but sometimes aligning and gaining consensus on a definition can be challenging. I think of another example with first-generation students. I'm pretty sure almost every state wants to support first-generation students, but it's about both collecting the necessary data and then gaining consensus on a definition. And sometimes definition discussions can be debilitating because there's just so many opinions about something, about what the definition means, which students that they serve, and that it could be challenging in being able to move forward from a policy perspective on something. And so hopefully we can provide some resources in that space.
Great. And there's one additional question here. Are there any plans to pursue any adjustment by cost of living index? So when we think about what the CHEF report adjusts for that at the state level, in thinking about this at the rural level, any future plans for that work or thoughts on that question?
That's a good question. I haven't considered that. I think to be actually useful, it would have to be at a sub-state level. Our focus here is really on things within states. And so if we adjust the same way CHEF does, it would adjust all the institutions in the state. And so we would need to look at cost of living differences within the state between rural and urban areas. I'll think about that. Thank you for that suggestion.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your attendance and attention to this important topic. And thanks again to our presenters for the important work that you've done here. As a follow-up for those of you that were able to participate today, we will be sending a copy of the full report, access to the recording here of this presentation and the slide deck that was used today, so you can capture all that information and continue to digest it. We'll also include a quick survey for you to respond, and there's an opportunity there to submit additional questions that can get to the report's authors, and we can route to the appropriate person to do a follow-up. So as we said off the top, we really hope that this can be a continuing and ongoing conversation as part of this work. As indicated by the final question there's different ways to think about modifications in the future that can make the report actionable for different subpopulations of people out in the space. So we'd love to continue to collect those ideas and stay in dialogue with all of you. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. And we look forward to the continued conversation. Have a great afternoon.